waiting for. And this is the chance for you to ask a question. It's now the audience question and answer session. But before we get stuck in, let me explain this segment's rules. Now, since we have 3 speakers, I will require 3 either rows of questioners or 3 groups of questioners, so that we can sequentially ask questions to the 3 speakers. So when you come forth, please specify who your question is for. And if it's not for the speaker whose turn it is at that moment, I will have to defer your question until we come to that speaker's opportunity, seeing that we've got 3 speakers. I hope you guys understand what I mean, but you will see it in action once we start the question and answer session. I have to give you some rules for the question and answer session. You have a maximum of 1 minute to ask a question. Now, Roy is going to be quite strict over that. We're not going to let you exceed 1 minute. So try to formulate your question to be within 1 minute. The question has to be relevant to today's topic, Israel and Palestine, a biblical and Quranic perspective. Please let's not ask questions on other topics like theology or scripture or things like that. Let's stick to today's topic. Unless those are relevant to today's topic, it's fine. But let's not go off at a tangent. You must ask a question. You will not be permitted to give a lecture here or engage in a debate with either any of the speakers or even a fellow audience member who may have asked a question that you took exception to. We just want you to ask a question relevant to the discussion you've heard, that's all. You may put a point across, but it has to be eventually transformed into a question. Like, for example, you can state a view or even a rebuttal or response to anything said, and then qualify that point at the end into a question by asking the speaker something like, could you give your response or view to what I have just said? That will be fine, as long as you qualify it into a question. You are allowed only 1 question at a time. If you have more questions, kindly go to the end of the queue after asking your first question and wait for a turn to ask again after the others in front of you have had their turn. You may also go to one of the other 2 queues if you also have questions for the other 2 speakers, but that's if we're going to form 3 queues. Finally, your question should be asked in a courteous and respectful manner, and with regards to the panelists or the speakers, they will have only 2 minutes to respond to your question. In other words, they'll have 2 minutes to answer, and time will be precisely monitored by our timekeeper, Roy Nagan. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you can start getting yourself ready to ask questions. Do we have a queue for questions, or are we just going to? I think you should say. Yeah. Question for Bashir. Yeah. Okay. Do we have a question for Bashir firstly?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Glenn, is your question for Bashir?
Can I start?
Yes, but who's your question for?
For Bashir.
Okay, it doesn't matter. Whoever it is for, you can start.
I'm going to sit down because this is a very touchy subject, and I have beautiful,
you have 1 minute.
Holy fear and trembling and respect to our loving, merciful, compassionate, mighty God, Abba Father. If Peter Cohen agrees, and the Chief Rabbi of South Africa, and Ray McCauley, who's in charge of the new CRL, and President Cyril Ramaphosa, who's in charge of the ANC that's against Israel, if those people and the same panel here can agree to be at the next talk, number 2, like this, in a venue in Johannesburg that can seat enough people with the SABC, with Israel Channel, with everybody. And then my question is to Shabir, when all this has been organized, God willing, inshallah, that your conditions to give Israel a chance, you must prepare the conditions, because you said earlier it's conditional that
Time is up.
That Israel stay where they are.
Okay. Glenn, could you? Okay. Time is up. Okay. Yes, Bashir, you can respond.
I am not giving the conditions. I am not giving any conditions. God is giving read out his conditions. And if Israel cannot meet those conditions, then it is the problem of Israel and God. I don't want to get in the middle of God and Israel. Believe me. Thank you.
No more questions.
Sorry.
No more questions.
Okay. Glenn, can we give somebody else a chance? Who else has a question for any of the speakers? Preferably it shouldn't be Bashir because he's already had a turn. So either to Brian or Kevin, and then we'll take it from there.
Afternoon, guys. This is a question for my friend Brian. Brian, I've heard arguments why the Israelites are entitled to Jerusalem, and I've heard arguments why Muslims are entitled to claim the land of Jerusalem. But I haven't heard any arguments to say why Christians from their scripture have an authority over Israel today, that they can say that we are entitled to the land of Israel.
Okay. Thank you, Mohammed Kavadia. You know, in John chapter 4, Jesus met the Samaritan lady at the well. And she was talking about how Jacob said we got to worship here. Then Jesus' response to them was, true worshippers don't have to worship on this mountain or that mountain. Them that worship God must worship Him in spirit and in truth. So we are not real estate focused as Christians. I do want to say, however, Jerusalem is the place that Jesus was tried, where Jesus was then under Pontius Pilate charged to be crucified. So we have in Jerusalem the Villa Dolorosa, the path that Jesus walked to Calvary's cross. And some Christians find that very important and they like to go and see that. But in truth, Christians must worship God in spirit and in truth. And the Father is seeking such that worship Him in spirit and in truth.
Thank you, Brian. A question now for Kevin. Is there anyone who wants to ask a question to Kevin? Anyone who has a question for Kevin? I see the lady at the back there.
Kevin, I don't know what your understanding is when we're talking about wars. When I read the Old Testament, when the Jewish people were not obeying God, God allowed them to be annihilated, or they didn't win their wars. But when they were in obedience, then they won their wars when they gave first place to God. So I'm just wondering what you think about that. And yeah.
As I answer, I think what you're suggesting, Penny, is that the fact that Israel is winning wars means that God is on their side. You know, it's like Voltaire, who said that God is always on the side of the winning battalion. We don't live under the old covenant anymore, and that's why you'll know that there are Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem who burn the Israeli flag, and there are Orthodox Jews who refuse to allow their children to serve in the military of the Israeli Defense Force. And there are religious Jews all over the world who oppose Zionism. They oppose Zionism because they still believe the old covenant is binding. And they are fearing God's retribution. They are fearing that God's severe punishment is going to come upon the Jewish people because of Zionism and because there's a secular Jewish state, which the Bible doesn't provide for. But we know that the old covenant is past. We're now in an age of grace. And the war that was taking place between God's people and other people is not relevant today. We are clearly told our battle is not against flesh and blood. We are clearly told that our mode of warfare is not carnal but spiritual. The type of wars that were fought in the Old Testament are not to be fought today, because the time of peace has arrived. Christ has made peace between God and man, and between man and each other who come to faith in Him. So I see no relevance today in who wins a war and who loses a war. The one with the strongest army is going to win the war. And that's not the Palestinians. You know, it's might is not right.
Time is up. Okay. Thank you. Now we want a question for Bashir. Anyone with a question for Bashir? Bashir? Sorry, was there a gentleman at the back that says a question? Okay, Penny, can he have a chance, please?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the organizing this presentation. I want to just first make a statement and then pass the question. The statement I'm making is the following. It has been said, I think I don't have the exact reference. God says the two brothers will be living in peace in the land. Now that's eschatology, that's future. There's going to be a time when both every Jew and every Arab, being brothers, will be living safely. That is the case in the future. Isn't it futile that at this stage we want to be able to take sides on who is right and who is wrong, because it is only God who knows what really is correct? Because you remember, we are able to be fed fake reports from every source, and every person has a bias on their persuasion. So should we then be spending a lot of time in that arena?
Time is up.
Instead of loving one another?
Time, please.
You see, one can take sides on the basis of justice and morality. We can't ignore it. And I gave you references, historical references, of Palestinian land, Palestinians living in the so-called land of Israel, which was Canaan. They were living there, and I've given you references, historical references, of the land being hijacked. So, absolutely, we should and we can take sides. Sitting on the fence is moral cowardice. And you have to ask yourself, as a Christian, is that what Christianity is all about? You have to ask yourself, as a Jew and as a Muslim, is that what Islam and Judaism is all about? That you simply need to sidestep morality, truth, and justice. I don't think so. I think we do need to stand up for what is correct. And when we do that, you're going to get peace in the Middle East. If we keep on sitting on the fence, waiting for some vague future time, I'm afraid that there's never going to be peace. I hope that answers your question.
Okay. Can we have a question for Brian? Okay, so gentleman, sorry, I think his hand went up first. Yeah. Sorry about it, Brian.
Okay, thank you very much. Firstly, I just wanted to remind Pastor Brian that he said something obviously not on the topic about people kissing stones and walls, and he forgot those who kissed the crosses. Anyway. But my question is, are you trying to say that Israel belongs to the Jews unconditionally? And who are the Jews by your definition? Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, for your side comment, kissing the cross is not fundamental or scriptural in the Christian faith, but kissing the black stone is fundamentally part of Hajj. And it seems like the Jews are kissing that wall quite frequently these days too. Be that as it may, these inanimate kissing religions, object kissing religions, must be reconciled to God through Christ. Now, you are asking about, just remind me,
what constitutes a Jew?
Oh, what constitutes a Jew? Yes.
Oh, sorry, I think that's
the land. I started my presentation by indicating that Judaism is a proselyting religion. So is Islam. So is Christianity. Are you an Arab? You're not an Arab. You are Muslim that dresses like an Arab because you are Muslim. You now have Mecca as your most important place. So too, when a person becomes a Jew, they then take on the importance of Judaism. And what's important to Judaism? Jerusalem. Now, I'm not at all advocating that Israel or Jerusalem must be exclusively for the Jews or those that want to be Jewish. No. Israel and Jerusalem should be for all nations. But that the land, as it is currently demarcated as a Jewish state, should remain. Under a Jewish state, all nations are welcome. And I think that should continue.
Time is up, right?
Question for Kevin? Any questions for Kevin? I think Mohammed is on.
Kevin, you say you've been to Jerusalem. When you went to Jerusalem, you understood and saw for yourself that the Christians and the Muslims both are Palestinians who live under the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority protects both the Jews and the Christians, and the Palestinian people today have become an oppressed people. You've been to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You've been to the church in Calgary, right? So,
I haven't.
oh, you haven't been to the church? Okay, it's in Jerusalem. It's a very popular landmark. I've been there a number of times. And what I've come to understand is the Muslims and the Christians work so hand in hand. There's so much unity and bondsman between themselves that till today, for the last couple of 100 years, till today, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is open and closed by a Muslim family. Because within the Christian denominations, there is not even consensus as to who should hold the keys. When you go to Bethlehem, you'll visit the Church of Nativity. This is where Jesus Christ was born.
Time is up. The question.
And the question is thus, that the Jews and the Christians are similarly oppressed by Israel at this moment in time. What's your opinion regarding that?
Well, the Palestinians historically, I mean, there are even Jews who still today call themselves Palestinians. There was an indigenous Jewish population in the land before the influx of immigrants started. Throughout the 2,000 years since the time of Christ, there's been an indigenous Jewish population, there's been a strong Christian population, and then since about 700 or so, there's been a Muslim population. And pretty much all the indigenous people are of the same blood. They say that most of the Palestinians are descended of Jews who either converted and became believers in Jesus very early on and stayed in the land, or they are descended of Jews who became Muslims after 700, which makes it quite ironic. I mean, it's one of the ironies of the history of modern Israel, is that the people who are there are ethnically actually probably more indigenous than some of the immigrants who've come from places like Russia. I know that there's I mean, there are Christians on both sides. There are Jewish Christians as well, and I know there are good relationships between the Jewish Christians and the Arab Christians. So I don't know how to answer your question, except to say it's tragic. What's happening there is really it's one of the tragedies of history in my view. That's really all I can say.
Question for Bashir?
Can this be the last round?
This is the last round, yeah. This will be, because we've got about 6 minutes left for questions, so this could be the last round.
I agree that love is the most important law, not the rules and regulations. But just a point that I want to ask you what you think about the genealogy. You were mentioning about the Jewish people, it's through the mother. That was only, as I understand it, fairly recently. The genealogy in the Bible has always been through the male, as you have head of the family. I have a Jewish husband, and Jewish people don't recognize that he is Jewish because he's now Messianic. He's become a believer in Christ. So the Jews even reject him. They accept atheists more so than him being Jewish. But my point is just about the genealogy as in Genesis, and that's as the Jewish line comes from there.
Time is up. The question.
Okay, Bashir, do you understand the question?
Look, love is important, but I think truth is even more important. You say in the Bible, genealogy was according to the father. However, the modern state of Israel, it's according to the mother, and I'm going to have to go according to the modern state of Israel. Now, that's my problem. You see, you can't live in two worlds. You can't say the Jewish state is based on the Bible, and then when it isn't, what do? Do you simply ignore it? Or are you honest enough to say, well, look, the modern Jewish state is a secular state. It has nothing to do with the Bible. It is unjust, and we need to oppose it on that level. If you're going to keep on dragging in the Old Testament, you're going to keep on dragging God in, well, then I'm going to have to debate with you on that basis. And that is the problem. That is the modern state of Israel based upon the Bible? They claim it is, then I'm going to hold them to that standard. If they say, look, we're not interested in the Bible, we are a modern secular state, we're not interested in God, fine, then we can argue on that basis. But that's not what they're saying. And I think it's something that Jews and Christians will have to come to terms with and ask themselves those questions. They're not asking it, and that's why I'm asking it. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to give the question for Brian to Farhad because he did put up his hand at the same time as the gentleman, slightly behind.
Hi, Brian. Firstly, in response to the video that you played, I'd like to invite you and the audience to please go onto YouTube and check out US talk show host Mike Malloy, in which he discusses this very Israeli-Palestinian question. But anyway, Kevin has provided enough evidence, I believe, to indicate that the God of the Bible stands clearly for truth and justice. Similarly, Bashir has provided evidence to show that Allah in the Quran stands firmly for righteousness. Your claim is that according to the Bible, God has indiscriminately given the land of Israel to the current Israelis or the Jews or whatever you wish to call them. Now, Kevin also displayed a slide in which he showed clearly how the current state of Israel transgresses these principles of truth and justice. So my question to you is, how do you reconcile this? Does God stand for truth and justice, or does God indiscriminately give land willy-nilly to whoever he pleases? Thank you.
Thank you, Farhad.
Okay, God doesn't do anything willy-nilly. God is definitely a God of righteousness, justice, and truth. Now, there's 2 points that I want to make very quickly. There is a generic claim, and I read it to you very quickly in Acts chapter 17, verse 26. Hear it again. From one man, he made every nation. God did. Of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth. These nations of men should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the times for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this. God did this. So God determined the exact places where the Chinese should live, where the Zulus should live, where the Ghanaians should live, where the Spanish should live. Now, in the determination of the exact places where people should live, did he determine a place where the Jews should live? Now, I can tell you that the Zulus are predominantly in KwaZulu-Natal because the Zulu monarchy was in KwaZulu-Natal, Shaka, Dingaan, and currently Goodwill. Every Jewish monarchy, when it existed, reigned from Jerusalem. There was no other monarchy that reigned in Jerusalem. Now you can talk about Herod. Herod was appointed by Caesar, and he sought to be a Jewish Messiah. So if you take that plain reading of the scripture, God determined where every nation should live. Farad, I put the question back to you. Where should the Jews live? Now, I also want to say we must understand that time. In 1947, the British split India with Pakistan and India.
Time up,
7
Brian.
million
Time, Brian.
on both sides were displaced.
This will be the last question. It's going to be for Kevin. So, any question for Kevin, please? I see the lady over there.
Hi, thank you. Kevin, do we know from history that the old covenant clearly shows it was for all people?
Can we tell from the scriptures
Yes.
that God's intention was to give the inheritance to all nations?
Yes.
Okay, is that the question?
Yes, please.
Yes, indeed. We do know that. And I'd love to read that passage to you, because it was in my presentation, but I speak so slowly that I got behind. And I couldn't get there. But there's a passage in Ezekiel chapter 47, and it addresses the Israel in its ultimate state. And in its ultimate state, Israel is envisaged, or the inheritance is envisaged as something that is for all nations. And I want to just read you that passage. So Ezekiel 47, it's talking about Israel in the future after the return from the exile in accordance with the fulfillment of God's ultimate purposes. You are to distribute this land amongst yourselves according to the tribes of Israel. You are to allot it as an inheritance for yourselves and for the aliens who have settled among you and who have children. You are to consider them as native-born Israelites. Along with you, they are to be allotted an inheritance amongst the tribes of Israel. In whatever tribe the alien settles, there you are to give him his inheritance, declares the sovereign Lord. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all for your excellent cooperation and participation during the question and answer session. That was really good, well done. We're now into our conclusion segment, where each speaker will talk to you one more time for just 5 minutes. Roy will alert them, and they have 1 minute.